All right, welcome everybody. I think people are flooding into the Zoom room. I'm just going to give this another few seconds here until I see everybody. Okay, I think most people are there. So let me start. I welcome you to our session today in our lecture series on the person. I'm Jens Zimmerman, director of the James M. Houston Center here at Regent, the Center for Humanity and Common Good. And today we have the privilege of having Professor Dr. Thomas Fuchs talk to us all the way from Germany in Heidelberg. Let me just briefly introduce our speaker, and then we'll give him the floor. So Professor Fuchs is Professor of Philosophy and Psychiatry, and he's the head of the section of Phenomenological Psychopathology and Psychotherapy at the University of Heidelberg. And the reason that we're bringing him on, well, one of the reasons, aside from him being an excellent and well-published scholar, is because of his disciplinary expertise of both philosophy and clinical psychiatry. He's the coordinator of the Heidelberg Marsilius project, Embodiment as a paradigm of an evolutionary cultural anthropology. And that gives you a sense of his interest in this whole area of embodied cognition. And he's also chairman of the German Society for Phenomenological Anthropology, Psychiatry, and Psychotherapy. Professor Fuchs has written a number of books. He hasn't mentioned one that I really liked and through which I really got to know him, which is The Ecology of the Brain, also by Oxford University Press, well worth looking at. More recently, he has written The Imagination and Social Perspectives Approaches from Phenomenology and Psychopathology with Rutledge, and also his newest publication, In Defense of the Human Being, also with Oxford University Press in 2021. Okay, Professor Fuchs, you can start the lecture, please.
Okay, fine. There was some disconnection shortly, but I think it should work now. Okay, I'm glad to be with you, and thank you for the invitation to this lecture. I share the screen, and I hope it works, that you should have the title and the first slide of my talk now, Personhood and Neuroscience. Now, the introduction. The question is whether we can find what constitutes a person.
I'm trying to get there, if I can get there.
Do we find what constitutes a person in the brain? Do a person's perceptions, thoughts, feelings, and desires show up in the brightly colored computer images of brain processes? Neurobiology, at least in its currently dominant interpretation, claims exactly this. A view into the skull becomes a view into the innermost part of the person, into her wishes and fears, happiness and suffering. Or so it seems. If you take, for example, David Eagleman, a famous popularizer of neuroscience, our thoughts and our dreams, our memories and experiences all arise from this strange neural material. Who you are is found within the intricate firing patterns of electrochemical impulses. So for neurobiology, the brain becomes the new subject, the thinker of our thoughts, the doer of our actions, and subjectivity itself seems to be only a useful illusion, as, for example, declared by Thomas Metzinger, one of Germany's neurophilosophers. I quote, "Ultimately, subjective experience is a biological data format, a highly specific mode of presenting information about the world by letting it appear as if it were an ego's knowledge. But no such things as selves exist in the world." Another popular illustration of this view is the thought experiment introduced first by Hilary Putnam into the debate, namely the brain in a vat, saying that if we were only brains in a nutrient solution, suitably stimulated by a computer or a supercomputer, then we would not notice the fact, because the brain would hallucinate a subject and a world that precisely resembled our experienced world completely, a perfect illusion like the computer-generated world of the Matrix. Metzinger also considers ordinary visual perception to be a kind of online hallucination, a technicolor film produced by the brain. And he adds, "In principle, you could have this experience without eyes, and you could even have it as a disembodied brain in a vat." The thought experiment of a brain transplant also seems to lead to the same result. If the brain of a person A were transplanted into the body of person B, then it seems that B would not receive a new brain, but person A a new body. So where the brain is, there obviously must also be the person. Or at least that's what neuroscientists assume. This simple fact, says neuroscientist Gazaniga, makes it clear that you are your brain. The neurons interconnecting in its vast network, discharging in certain patterns modulated by certain chemicals, controlled by thousands of feedback networks, that is you. Well, of course, this is anything but a fact. Nevertheless, the brain seems to be the only part of the body that we need to have in order to be ourselves. Persons, it seems, are cerebral subjects, and images of the brain are the modern icons of the person. Still another development contributes to the identification of person and brain, namely the rationalistic conception of personal identity, which goes back to John Locke. According to him, this identity is based solely on conscious memory and self-consciousness, not on physical existence. I remain myself as long as I can remember and ascribe my former states to myself. Otherwise, my identity would be destroyed. This psychologization of the person meant a radical departure from the Aristotelian position according to which persons were basically living beings, embodied in a physical body. And since the brain was increasingly regarded as the seat of memory and consciousness, Locke's reinterpretation also encouraged the equation of person and brain. Now, all these views of personhood have one thing in common. They are based on the ultimately dualistic premise that there is only consciousness and brain, only the mental and the physical. The living being, or the living organism as the underlying unit, however, no longer appears. Conscious activities are not regarded as functions of an organism, but are equated with brain processes. In this view, the body remains a mere carrier apparatus for the brain, in which the inner world of consciousness is created. Now, I will subject this neuro-reductionist concept of the person to a critique. And my counter thesis will be the brain is only an organ of the person, not the seat of the person. Personhood means embodied subjectivity. I will start with a critique of the cerebral subject, then explain personhood as embodied subjectivity in more detail, and then come back to the idea of a brain transplantation. Now, to start with a critique and the role of subjectivity. Is the brain the locus of subjectivity and consciousness? We can think back to Leibniz's well-known mill comparison from his monadology. I quote, "If you think of a machine whose equipment would be designed in such a way that it could think, feel, and perceive, then you can think of it proportionally enlarged in such a way that you could enter it like a mill. When you look inside it, however, you will find nothing more than individual parts that come into contact with each other, but never anything that could explain a perception." Now, this still applies today. Whoever examines the brain of a human being finds nerve cells and electrochemical processes, but never the person's fear or pain, his sensations or thoughts. Neither neurons nor brain centers, nor brains as a whole, are subjects of an experience. The visual cortex is certainly necessary for seeing, but it itself sees nothing at all, because seeing, perceiving, and feeling are activities of living beings. So dogs, cats, and humans see something. It is not their brains that see. And anyone who tries to find seeing within a living being has already overlooked it by looking at it too closely. So when brain researchers claim that consciousness is undoubtedly located in the brain, they are subject to a category mistake. People are conscious, not brains. And the fact that we cannot see consciousness, but only conscious people, does not mean that experience can be found in a hidden place inside them. Consciousness is not at all a localizable object to which one could point, like we can point to a stone or an apple. Rather, it is an activity of a human being or a relationship between subject and world. It is a perception of, speaking with, remembering something, desiring something, etc. That is, it is a directed process that opens up a world. And this intentional relationship of subject and world cannot be reified and locked up in the skull. So where then is consciousness, perception, or thinking? This question itself is already wrongly posed. A second objection: is subjective experience at all objectifiable? Can it be described in objective, that means in neurobiological terms? Thomas Nagel has shown that every subjective experience is tied to a centered perspective that cannot be reconstructed in an objective physical description. How does it feel to have exactly this pain, to experience this fear? Can the fact that I am feeling pain be described from a third-person perspective too, namely as a certain neuronal activity pattern in my brain? No, because even the reformulation, Thomas Fuchs is now in pain, no longer expresses the fact that it is my pain and that it is I who suffers from it. And even if this statement were to be reliable true in all cases from the third-person perspective, for example, on the basis of simultaneous observation of my brain states, it would still lack the decisive characteristic of subjectivity, namely that I myself I'm precisely this Thomas Fuchs to whom the statement refers. And this would even be more true for an exact description of all the physical processes in my brain. Nowhere in such descriptions could one find the mineness or the painfulness of my pain. So between the two ways of talking about pain lies a categorical gap. The reality of my pain is of a fundamentally different kind than the reality of objective physical facts. And in a certain sense, it is even more real than these facts. Now, let us turn to embodiment. The objections against neuroreductionism are based on the irreducible intentionality and subjectivity of personal consciousness, as I've demonstrated so far. But the scope of the concept of the person is not yet exhausted. The fact that a person's experience and actions cannot be identified with brain processes becomes even more apparent when we look beyond pure consciousness to the living reality of the person. And this reality clearly rests upon the person's corporeality or embodiment, not only in the sense that consciousness presupposes a functional body, but also in the sense that a person realizes and represents herself in his or her body, and that we can identify the person with her physical appearance each time we encounter her. Most of our activities are tied to the medium of the body. In order to be able to feel, to hear, to see, or speak, we obviously need not only a brain, but also a feeling, hearing, seeing, and speaking body. And it is not that we thereby use the body as a mere external instrument. For when I dance a waltz, I do not set my limbs in motion from the outside, but I myself, I am the one who dances by swinging in to the rhythm of the music and executing my movements kinesthetically. An experienced dancer, an actor, or pianist is therefore unlikely to get the idea of identifying himself with his head or with his brain. My body processes have their own operative intentionality. The body with its movements has meaningful movements, purposeful and adapted to the environment without me having to control them from the outside. Of course, this also requires corresponding neural dispositions and processes, namely patterns of movement sequences in the motor cortex or the basal ganglia. But even these do not control or determine my limbs as if they were mere executing organs. Rather, the neuronal functions themselves are embedded in the constant circular interaction of bodily movement, reaction and resistance of the environment, and kinesthetic, tactile, and visual perception. So the body with its senses and limbs is the actual player on the field, while the brain acts as a mediator for these interactions. It connects and modifies the feedback interrelations. But still, I dance and move as a living bodily being, and this is only mediated by my brain. I do not set my limbs in motion from outside of the brain, from the inside of the brain, like a homunculus. My embodiment, therefore, fundamentally shapes my personal way of being in the world, to find myself as this body, to have this shape and constitution, to be a child or an adult, to be man or woman, small or large, healthy or handicapped. That is the starting point of all self and world experience. Conversely, one's individual development is not only reflected in a psychic character or personality structure, The body is also the carrier and expression of the individual biography. It has and it knows its own history. This is what we can call body memory. From birth on, the experiences that the child has with people and things are sedimented as behavioral patterns, skills, habits. And this bodily memory, implicitly effective in every action and behavior, constitutes the individual habitus of a person, his or her personal way of living in the world and of interacting with others. The person is formed in and through his body. He appears in it more and more clearly and individually. His being is continual becoming, and this becoming is increasingly a doing. The body is therefore not only a shell, is therefore not a shell behind which the person is hidden and is indicated only symbolically. Rather, a person's attitudes, behavior, and habits are always simultaneously attitudes, movement patterns, and dispositions of their body. We recognize persons by their posture and behavior. Their embodiment is part of their personality, their identity. So not only inner psychological or mental characteristics, but also the individual body constitutes the person. Therefore, we are embodied persons for each other too. We do not perceive the other as a material object, from whose outer movements we infer an inhabitant within, hidden as in a capsule. The body is rather the living appearance of the person. And in it, the person presents and manifests him or herself. In her gaze, I see the other person himself or herself. Taking her hand in greeting, I give the other my hand. And in her words, I hear the person himself. If the person were somewhere inside the body, we would only see empty glances, and instead of words, we would only hear sounds in which no one speaks. Persons, however, are the primordial phenomena, that which shows itself and which is itself present in its very appearance. The identification of personality and brain becomes completely absurd once we consider the person in her constitutive relationality, in her social relationships. A person's family and relationships, her social roles, such as gender, profession, or status, are inseparably linked to the concept of the person. And it is no coincidence that the very word person, persona, itself originates from the world of theater. As it is well known, persona was the theatrical mask or role, and derived from this the role of an individual in society. To be a person means that a person only becomes a person as such through participation in social relationships. And the concept is certainly not restricted to the individual. To be a person is to occupy a place within a field where other people have their places, as Robert Spearman writes. Persons only exist in the plural. And personal identity rests not on a self-sufficient inwardness, but is necessarily of a relational nature. I do not have to search very far for others, writes Merleau-Ponty. I find them in my experience, namely in the relationship patterns, in my modes of reaction, in my preferences that make up my personality. We are in no way locked inside ourselves. The intersubjective nature of the person, it applies equally to the characteristic that is often regarded as the special proof of one's individuality, namely self-consciousness. This too is an achievement that requires community and interaction with others. I quote Karl Jaspers here: "I exist only in communication with the other. A single isolated consciousness would be without communication, without question and answer, therefore without self-consciousness. It must recognize itself in the other self." This already applies to the development in early childhood. In the first year of life, the infant learns to grasp that others are like me by imitating them and communicating with them non-verbally, prelingually. So recognizing oneself in others in this way is a prerequisite for the ability to take others' perspectives, and finally to self-reflect, the ability which the child acquires in the course of further practical interactions. The child learns to see him or herself through the eyes of others. And this interactive dynamic is permanently reflected in the structure of personality. For self-consciousness contains intersubjectivity. It has internalized the relationship with others as a constitutive moment. Because the self-relationship implies the capacity to see oneself from the perspective of the generalized other, as George Herbert Mead put it, and to speak to oneself as what someone else would speak to you. In this sense, Plato already understood thoughts as the inner conversation of the soul with itself, which goes on without a voice. The mobility of perspective and the ability to reflect are the result of an originally interactive movement. And in this respect, the basic structure of personhood is not to be understood purely individualistically, but only as a dynamic, open structure. Self-consciousness is a self-talk that always implicitly includes others. And it is obvious that this complex, self-referential and intersubjective structure of self-awareness eludes a reduction to local brain activities. Now, we will not find our experiences in the brain, I said, nor even sufficient neural correlates for them, as indispensable as brain activity certainly is. So how is the relationship between person and brain to be adequately understood? I said that human beings think, feel, perceive, and act, and not brains. And the human being is first of all a living organism, a being of flesh and blood. And this also corresponds to the classical understanding of the person as a unit of body and mind. So persons exist only as embodied subjects, as living beings. However, for current neuroscience, the body plays only a subordinate role. It remains a kind of physiological carrying device for the brain. But this cerebrocentrism neglects the interrelationships and circuits in which the brain is situated. That would be as if one were to examine the heart without the circulation, or the lungs without respiration. And the reason for this is that neuroscience has no concept of the living organism. What is missing was already recognized in the 19th century by Ludwig Feuerbach, a German philosopher, which I quote, "It is neither the soul which thinks and senses, nor the brain, for the brain is a physiological abstraction, an organ removed from the totality, separated from the skull, the face, the body as a whole. But the brain is only an organ of thought as long as it is connected with a human head and body." So only a living person and a living person can think and feel. So in contrast to the usual identification of brain and mind, I therefore propose a concept in which the living being is the primary entity, or in the case of humans, the person as a living being. But the living being appears under two aspects. On the one hand, on the left side, as a lived body, a subject body showing integral acts of life that are experienced in the first or second person perspective. And on the other hand, on the right side, as a physiological, as a living body, with physiological processes, including, for example, brain processes. In other words, the person and the living being may be regarded either as Leib, living body, a lived body, or as Körper, physiological or living body. The one in the personalistic attitude, the other in the naturalistic attitude. The first aspect corresponds to the first and second person perspective, to the body as the center of subjective and intersubjective experience. The other belongs to the third person perspective. So now, instead of a gap between two radically different ontologies, the mental and the physical, we now have a duality of aspects within embodiment, with a common reference to the living being. And the question then is about the relation between our body as we live and experience it subjectively, and our body as an organism in the world. In the last 2 decades, a new direction has developed in the cognitive and neurosciences that brings these interrelationships to the fore, the paradigm of embodied and inactive cognition. And it regards consciousness and subjectivity as embodied and enacted through the ongoing interaction of an organism with its environment. So consciousness is no longer located in the brain, but extends over the perceived body into the environment. How can we conceive this in more detail? Now, conscious experience is based on 2 circles of continuous interaction, namely between brain and body, and between brain, body, and environment. I'm now going to look at these 2 circles in more detail. First, at the circles of organismic self-regulation. All consciousness is primarily based on the constant interaction of the brain with the rest of the organism. That means on the signals from the limbs, the movements, the muscles, the heart, circulation, not least on the biochemical milieu of blood and cerebrospinal fluid in which the brain is embedded. And signals from these peripheral systems are processed in the brainstem and diencephalon, while conversely neuronal and neuroendocrine signals constantly regulate the internal milieu of the body. And this circular interaction of brain and the entire organism forms the basis for a background consciousness, a basic experience that always accompanies us, whatever we currently are perceiving, thinking, or doing. It is, as Damasio called it, the feeling of life itself, with a hue of well-being or discomfort, pleasure or displeasure, freshness or exhaustion, providing a pre-reflective self-experience or what it is likeness. This primordial feeling of being alive reflects the current state of the body along varied dimensions, for example, along the scale that ranges from pleasure to pain. And they originate at the level of the brainstem rather than the cerebral cortex. It is true that our attention is mostly focused on perceptions, imaginations, or thoughts. But all higher intentional performances always remain embedded in the basal bodily self-experience. The maintenance of homeostasis, that is the primary function of consciousness, as manifested in instinct, hunger, thirst, lust, or aversion. We can also put it this way: processes of life and processes of experience, Leben in German and Erleben, are inseparably linked. As conscious beings, we are at the same time living, embodied beings. And in the same way, the emotions are also linked to the interaction between brain and the rest of the organism. Moods and feelings are, from a biological point of view, always states of the whole organism, including almost all subsystems of the body: central and peripheral nervous system, hormonal system, heart, circulation, respiration, viscera, facial and gestural expression muscles. It is not possible to experience any feeling without changes in this body landscape. And without this bodily resonance, we could not experience feelings in the full sense. Now, let us move on to the next circle, which I mentioned. Namely, it's the circle of sensory-motor interaction between organism and environment. Every perception and action also requires the body, of course, but not only as an apparatus for signal transmission, but also because only the sensitive and mobile body conveys the unity of perception and action, which we may express as a sensory-motor cycle, linking action and perception with the object. Jakob von Uexküll, the German biologist, spoke primarily of the sensory-motor functional cycle. What a living being perceives is always dependent on its movement and vice versa. This applies to the movements of the hand that touches an object, as well as to the scanning of objects with the moving gaze. We perceive actively. That means we look at, we listen to, we feel for something. And perception is not merely an internal state of the brain, but a continuous bodily interaction with the environment. Actions are, of course, even more embodied. When I speak, this is not only based on a motor program in my brain, but also on the constant feedback of my throat muscles, on hearing my own voice, as right now, and the reactions of the listeners, although this is kind of thwarted by our transmission here. Anyway, speaking, just like grasping or dancing, is certainly not an ability of the brain, but of an embodied subject. In general, the brain and its networks provide open loops, as it were, which are closed by the body and the suitable objects in the environment to form the respective sensory-motor circle. Conscious experience, therefore, arises only in the overarching system of organism and environment, through the interplay of many components. The brain is the organ that mediates these interactions. In short, it is an organ of mediation and relation. But within the brain itself, there is no experiencing, no consciousness, no thoughts. For comparison, one can think of another central life function, namely breathing. Can we find breathing within the lungs? Certainly not. Respiration is not localizable in any single place. It is the entire process in which the organism takes in air, transforms it, and gives it out again. So an exchange, a circular process, which wouldn't be possible without the environment, the respiratory organs, the blood circulation, the whole metabolism. The lung, too, is a relational organ that can only perform its function embedded in circular processes. But the same applies to consciousness. It is not to be found in one single place. It is not an inner image of the world in the brain, but is itself the living process of our embodied interaction with the world. So both breathing and consciousness are functions of life. The brain is indispensable, certainly, for conscious experience, because all the circular processes which are now mentioned are linked together within the brain, comparable to the tracks that converge in a main railway station. But the train traffic as such, and the whole traffic, is certainly not generated by this brain station, no, by the train station, nor can it be localized there. In the same way, the activity of consciousness represents the ecological integral of the entire relationship between brain, organism, and environment. Consciousness is being in the world. Now, finally, this consideration of embodiment also sheds a critical light on the thought experiment of brain transplantation, which I mentioned at the beginning. The person's implied or assumed identity with the brain is based on the assumption that his identity consists of nothing more than his psychological dispositions, memories, and knowledge, which should be stored in the neural structures of the brain. But the transplantation argument thus presupposes a Cartesian, a disembodied view of the person. As we saw, selfhood consists primarily in a pre-reflexive bodily background feeling, which is not based on neuronal processes in the cerebral cortex, but on the life process of the entire organism. The embedding of the brain in biochemical, neuroendocrine, and humoral processes of vital self-regulation cannot be understood according to digital information processing in a computer. However, it is from these circular living processes that basal self-experience results. So what is presupposed in the transplantation thought experiment, namely the continuity of phenomenal self-awareness after brain transplantation, is anything but self-evident. We do not know in the slightest what the consequences of a separation of brain and body, and thus an interruption of the continuity of life and experience, would be. In any case, it is highly questionable whether the conscious functions would regenerate at all after the brainstem has been separated from the spinal cord and re-implanted in a new body. For a successful transplant, the complex feedback loops between brain and body would also have to be precisely restored at the vital and sensory motor level. And even then, serious disturbances of self-experience would have to be expected because the entire endocrine, autonomic, interoceptive, and emotional reactions of the foreign body would no longer match the neuronal dispositions of the brain. A severe self-alienation and disorientation up to psychotic confusion would be the most likely consequence. Moreover, every bodily ability based on procedural bodily memory, so walking, grasping, or speaking, not to mention playing the piano or other complex abilities, is tied to highly subtle brain-body coordinations and would all have to be relearned. Finally, let us think of the disturbing effects on one's identity on one's experience of identity that would be expected from suddenly having a foreign body's shape, a different voice, a foreign face, and the alienated reactions of our friends and acquaintances. All of these factors only allow the conclusion that a brain transplant would not preserve the identity of the person, but would at best create a new, severely disturbed individual who would not have any clear continuity with either the donor or the recipient of the transplant. The person is embodied in his or her body, and a separation of brain and body would not preserve, but destroy the person. To conclude, if neurobiology wants to look inside the person, it is looking in the wrong place. Not that neuronal processes are dispensable for conscious experience, on the contrary, but they are not the place where we find the consciousness and selfhood of a person. A person feels, sees, thinks, and acts, not the brain, nor the mind, nor consciousness. We are neither brains nor minds, but living beings, embodied and visible in our bodies. And there is no second version of ourselves existing inside us, inside our brains, or inside our minds. The brain has neither mental states nor consciousness, because the brain does not live. It is only the organ of a living being or a living person. Thought experiments about a brain in a vat or brain transplant can be set aside. Only a brain that is connected to a sentient and mobile body is able to serve as central organ for mental processes, because only through the constant interactions of brain, body, and environment can the structures of conscious experience be created and stabilized. It is therefore wrong to identify the subject or person with the brain and to search for the personal there. What constitutes a person essentially is her embodiment, her aliveness, as well as her being in relationships. And these relationships to the world are not to be found. They are neither products of the brain nor to be found in it. Undoubtedly, the abilities of the person are closely tied to brain functions. The brain is therefore a crucial condition of the possibility of personal existence in the world. However, the person is not a part of the body, but the body-mind unity, or the living human being. Or in short, persons have brains, but they are certainly not their brains. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Fuchs, for this very clear and holistic talk and the defense, in fact, of the person. You've also kept very good time, so we have time for at least 2 questions, I would say.
Okay.
And we'll have people write them into the chat box, and we'll read them out to you so that you can answer. Jameson, do we have one?
Yes, we've got one.
Okay, so here's the first one.
Is consciousness produced by purely materialistic processes, or do we need a divine intervention to produce human consciousness? Do other living beings have consciousness in your model?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, well, to answer the second question first, certainly this kind of embodiment and embodied processes at the basis of experience and consciousness are not restricted to human beings, but are obviously also present, at least in higher mammals and in higher organized animals, where we can find consciousness, whether it is dependent on the central nervous system or the nervous system alone, is a question that is hard to answer. But in any case, consciousness is not restricted to human beings. And the first question, I don't think that we need a divine intervention to explain consciousness as a function of the organism. But there remains, of course, a kind of a gap of explanation, because we do not know exactly how the organism as such can produce a kind of inwardness. We only know that the organism as such is the basis for it. The organism, however, is not just material processes. It is not a conglomerate, not just a lump of matter. The organism is living, and as I said, life is the decisive carrier of conscious activity, of conscious experience. So I wouldn't say consciousness is just a product of material processes. It is a function of living processes, and that is a quite different concept and a quite different entity. That's my basic assumption or my basic thesis. We need life. We need a concept of life to explain and to understand how consciousness can come into the world, although we do not understand it completely.
Well, thank you very much. Another question, someone is wondering if you have any thoughts about emergent theory, and if you could explain that as well for those of us who aren't familiar.
Well, you could apply the concept of emergence to such a concept, because talking about the living being and the organization of the living being already presupposes that we reach a new level here, a level of interrelations and a level of organization which cannot be explained bottom up by physics. So physics is not able to reduce living processes to kind of interaction of molecules or atoms. This is a concept of higher level emergence, which includes a top-down causality, or what is also called a top-down or vertical causality, which means that the whole organizes and includes the parts into an activity, into an order that is not created and not explainable on the bottom level. So this would be a kind of emergence. Emergence just in the sense of a higher level existing and making appearance in the course of evolution, which cannot no longer be explained on the bottom level. So far.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. There is another question that's come through. With a degenerative disease personality change, for example, through Alzheimer's or something like that, how do you understand this interplay between brain / body and personhood? Is this real or artificial? What's going on there?
Well, the brain, as I said, is an indispensable, so a necessary condition for conscious life. It is not the sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition. So in dementia or Alzheimer's disease, we find that certain functions, in particular memory functions, that are dependent on the functions of certain brain areas and brain centers are degenerated and are no longer functioning. So many diseases and, for example, lesions of the brain lead to a loss of the special function, because the function is bound to certain certain specialized centers of the brain. However, that doesn't mean that the whole of conscious experience or the whole of personal life is found in the brain. And that is particularly important for our view on dementia, for our view of dementia, and for our view on demented persons. Because if we think that the brain functions are the basis of personhood, then we would be inclined to see demented patients as somehow lacking their personhood, as somehow losing their identity, which is actually what many bioethicists claim, that demented patients or severely demented patients are no longer persons, but only post persons or quasi persons. But if we think and we consider the embodied being of the person, then we would easily see that even in advanced dementia, we find many manifestations and expressions of personal life in the body and in the embodied behavior of the patient. He still has a lot of embodied memories, body memories that help him to deal with objects, to feel the emotional relation with others, to express himself or herself. So even though he might no longer be able to remember the narrative history of his life, he is still the individual person with his or her body history, which is manifested through her behavior. And in this sense, we can see the person still in her embodied appearance. I think this changes our view of dementia quite a lot, although certainly there's no question that the brain is damaged and is no longer functioning to provide the basis and the dispositions that we need to have certain autobiographical memories.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our time. So we'll end the public lecture portion here. Thank you so much, Professor Fuchs, for your clear answers to the questions. If you have further questions that haven't been answered, please do send them to us. I saw there may be a few more in the chat, and we'll see if we can get answers to you. And other than that, for the public, I bid you goodbye and hope that you're tuning in again next week. And for our class, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll reconvene with Professor Fuchs for our seminar session. Thank you so much, everyone.